Welcome to another Logos Live. Today I've got a very special guest with me, N.T. Wright, also known as Tom Wright, author of quite a few books that I myself own personally within Logos. In fact, this Baptist bought Anglican bronze so that I could have the New Testament and the people of God. I have profited from Wright's writings over time, especially my favorite is Surprised by Hope. But he's coming out with a new book with Zondervan Academic called Into the Heart of Romans. It's an exposition of, there it is, thank you very much, Dr. Wright, because I don't have a physical copy. I've just got a PDF that the publisher sent me that I've been going through and marking up. We're going to talk about that today in a half-hour interview. Thank you so much for coming on to Logos Live, Dr. Wright.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's jump right in to talk about Romans. I was helped by your initial argument about Romans 8:1. There is therefore now no condemnation. And I have puzzled over that therefore, and I've looked at the commentaries over time. But you presented an illuminating parallel with other examples for how we ought to read that therefore. Could you explain it to our viewers?
Yes, I mean, at first blush, of course, the very gloomy situation as it appears at the end of Romans 7 would not justify the therefore, but of course Paul immediately goes on so that after the first verse, 8:1, you've got explanatory remarks with the Greek word gar, meaning for or because. There is therefore now no condemnation for those in Messiah Jesus, because. And in the book, I use a silly illustration where I say something like, unfortunately, my car is out of petrol, the tires are shot to pieces, the carburetor is not functioning. Therefore, I have no problem getting to my destination because here is a mechanic, here is somebody to fill the car with gasoline, and here is the other mechanic that I need to do the other job, whatever it is. In other words, the initial therefore sounds absurd. I've got all these problems, therefore I'm getting home free. But then because comes in to back up the therefore. And I think it's a clever way of arguing for Paul because it sets him up so that he can give these initial explanations of why there is no condemnation, which then look all the way on from chapter 8, verses 1 to 4, to the great climax of the chapter in 8:31 to 39, when he explains if God is for us, who can be against us, which is really returning to the same point. So he's pointing ahead all the time, while the therefore appears to point back confusingly as initially to Romans 7.
That's so helpful. And your little illustration there and your style, which is very much classic N.T. Wright, or Tom Wright, actually, depending on which kind of book you're reading of Wright's, totally reminds me of the books of yours that I actually turn to most frequently, which would be the Paul for Everyone series. I've got that in Logos. And what I'm looking for often as a preacher, because I preach regularly, teach regularly in church, is that kind of very down-to-earth parallel that helps me explain. When I first picked up those commentaries, I wasn't sure what to expect, and that's what I found over and over. Let me ask you a question about Into the Heart of Romans that relates to that. As I read this, I'm seeing you using transliterated Greek words, effectively just did verbally just now, mentioning gar. And I see that this is a Zondervan academic title, but the heavy use of footnotes and the very intense academic explorations and quibbling and quoting with lots of people, I didn't see that. I felt like this is aimed at a unique audience, a more broad audience than I thought likely when I first heard about the book. Can you describe the audience you were aiming at?
Yes, this book started off as lectures in the seminary where I teach part-time now in retirement. That's Wycliffe Hall in Oxford. And these were given first thing on a Monday morning when they do their Bible expositions, which is like 8:30 on a Monday morning. It's not the best time to hit people with a slew of footnotes and references to scholars. They've got a whole week ahead of them for that. And I wanted to be able to get them to see for themselves how to dig down into the letter. And actually the techniques I use would apply to any Pauline letter. But then I developed the material a bit for some lectures I then did in Houston in Texas. Actually, no, these ones, were in Waco in Texas in the summer before last. And the audience there was mostly pastors and in some cases lay leaders of churches from around the States and indeed around the world. And though undoubtedly many of them had read commentaries on Romans, etc., the context of the lectures was not the kind of thing where they were expecting lots of engagement with this commentator and that commentator. And in a sense, I had the feeling that after having spent 50 years of my adult life studying this stuff, I think I have sort of earned the right to be able to say, okay, there are lots of footnotes we could put in, but after all that I've done, here is how I think the text actually works, and now go figure. So, yes, from one point of view, the fact that there's transliterated Greek makes it look more like an academic textbook, but it's not trying to offer the equivalent of an article in the Journal of Theological Studies or in Novum Testamentum or something like that. And I hope as a result, it will tease people who've maybe got a little bit of Greek or maybe would like to have some Greek, because you can read the book without knowing any Greek, but it will
Right.
constantly say to you, but it would be so much more helpful if you just got a little bit at least and then built on that. So that's the way I was hoping to come in.
Yeah, that was successful. You performed the
Good.
opposite of what's been called in the U.S. the soft bigotry of low expectations. You raised the bar, but you made that as accessible as possible. I don't know how else to put it. I can't think of another book
Good.
that's quite like that. I enjoyed that aspect. I also
Well,
felt it's more efficient.
well, it was an experiment for me, and I enjoyed it. Yeah.
I enjoyed it as well. I feel like I can go elsewhere to get those footnotes, but I came to that book to read N.T. Wright. And that's, of course, what I got. You had a little comment in the book that I'll read. You said the Israel dimension is vital and non-negotiable in the Christian narrative. I grieve that it's missing from many popular gospel presentations. But I wanted to tell you a tiny little story and ask you to reflect on it. I was giving the gospel to the shoeshine lady at the airport. Now, this is a number of years ago. And I can't remember exactly what I asked her, something about her future, or would you like to know the good news of the Christian faith? And her face lit up. She wanted to know. And here she is shining my shoes. And I'm telling her, and for whatever reason, I'm a seminary student, I started to give more the story of the Bible instead of the Romans road that I'd been trained on and had given previously. And as the story went on, I'm telling about Adam and Eve, I'm telling about Abraham, I'm telling about Israel. I saw her face fall. She was disappointed. This wasn't the apparently simple message she was expecting. So I think I was trying to do something of what you were describing in your book. In that particular case, that meant she was not interested rather than interested. I want to know, what did I do wrong? Or can you tell me, how would you give a gospel message then, incorporating what you mentioned about Israel in a situation like that one where it's got to be quick?
When it's got to be quick, I mean, inevitably there are all sorts of sacrifices one makes. I will tell you a little story, namely that the publishers asked me to write a children's Bible, and which is coming out next year, God willing. And they said you can have 150 double-page spreads of a maximum of 150 words each. Now, that's like the shoeshine lady. How are you going to do this whole thing? Presumably, you're going to want at least 35 or 40 of the segments are going to be about Jesus himself, but you're going to tell the whole story: Adam, Abraham, as you say, Israel, King David, all the great stories. And I was determined I was going to get it into Paul, because a lot of children's Bibles maybe have the conversion of Paul or his shipwreck, but they don't mention anything about his letters. And I thought, you cannot have a Bible, even a children's Bible by Tom Wright, without having Paul being quite an important playing part and quite an important part. So in a sense, that was the equivalent for me of that same question. And as I thought about what you just said, I thought, well, if you're really doing the Romans road, well, as most people would agree, reading Romans with any understanding, Adam is actually there in Romans 1 and Romans 3, and is then explicitly in
Right.
Romans 5, and actually implicitly in Romans 8 as well. So telling the Romans road without Adam is a bit risky. And then particularly, Abraham is front and center in Romans 4.
Right.
So that if you've told the Romans road missing out Adam and Abraham, whoever's road it isn't the Romans' road, and that is a real problem with the whole Romans' road. And I've often said to people, I'd much rather somebody was using the Romans' road to tell them about Jesus than that they were telling them to go and be a Buddhist or a Hindu or something, because at least we're talking about Jesus and you and God and His love and grace and all the rest of it. However, the way that I think I would do it is to say, we all know the world is in a mess. Extraordinarily, the Bible tells a story of how the God who made the world and was grieving over it called one family to spearhead his rescue operation, and that family were themselves part of the problem as well as part of the solution. And so when God came in person, he took upon himself the problem and the solution, and his death and resurrection do away with the sense of the unresolved problem, and his resurrection launches the new creation, which was what God always planned from the beginning. Now, I'm not saying that any shoe-shined lady would necessarily respond to that, but I think I got Adam and Abraham and a bit of David and Chronicles and whatever in there as well. Because if you do what so many have done, and I've seen people do this, where people say, oh, we believe in the narrative of the Bible. And then they say, God made the world, he made humans, and unfortunately they sinned. And then they might say, so he tried with this early,
Right.
having
First
an early
draft.
shot at rescuing them by calling his family called Israel. But unfortunately that didn't work. So he sent Jesus instead. And that is just disastrous, because the New Testament's portrayal of Jesus is not instead of Israel. That's the source of a great many evils in the world and in religion, etc. The way Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul, and all the rest tell the story of Jesus is this is where that long Israel story was going all along. And you have to find a myriad ways of saying that, depending on whether you're faced with a class of graduate students or with the shoe-shine lady.
Right. You don't know who your audience is going to be until the Lord
Yeah,
puts them in front of you sometimes.
that's right.
Some of the themes that you brought up, your brief presentation to the shoe-shine lady, reminded me as well of your discussion of penal substitution. And one thing that you said in the book was that the particular passage in Romans 8 where this comes up is, I think you said, the clearest example of a New Testament teaching on this topic. Could you expand on that just a little bit?
Yes. The problem there, I don't know if you know my book, The Day the Revolution Began.
That is one I have not read.
But in that book, I kind of go at the popular presentations of penal substitution and the danger with those popular presentations, and I've heard many in my time, and I've preached a few of them too myself, is that what people hear, even if you don't intend to say it like this, is God so hated the world that he killed Jesus, instead of God so loved the world that he sent his son. I said this in a conference a few years ago, and an angry professor stood up and said, that's a caricature. No young person hears that. And another professor on the platform with me got to his feet and said, I teach first year in college. He said, this is what all my students think the Christian gospel is, and they know this angry, hateful God figure, and they hate him back, or they don't want anything to do with him. So my analysis then was that presentation comes because, and it seems a little complicated, but I think it's really important, we've done three things in Western Christianity. We have Platonized our eschatology, that is to say, we think that the whole point of the game is for our souls to go to heaven, which is what is taught in the first century by Plutarch, not by Paul.
Right.
But because we've Platonized our eschatology, we think, oh, well, the problem is that I'm bad, I'm sinful, so how can my soul go to heaven? So we've made anthropology, that is what are humans, all about morals. We've Platonized our eschatology, so we've moralized our anthropology. And then we've paganized our soteriology. That is to say, God so hated the world that he killed Jesus. The two great pagan works of poetry, Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid, begin with wrath and arms. And that just tells you that's how the pagan world, ancient pagan world, saw things in terms of angry gods and angry people slugging it out. Instead, the gospel bursts out and says, no, the God who made the world is the God of love. And the way that the penal substitution then works is precisely by God setting up this category of Israel, of Abraham's family, to be the place and the means by which the world would be rescued, so that then evil attacks and does its worst. That's what Romans 7 is all about. And Paul calls it sin. We might say sin with a capital S, which is almost a way of saying the Satan. And Satan concentrates on Israel and builds up so that Israel's rebellion against God is the worst thing there could be. And what happens to that rebellion is God takes it into himself in the person of his Son, so that sin can be condemned. But he doesn't say God condemned Jesus. He says God condemned sin in the flesh of Jesus. Therefore, there is no condemnation for those who belong to Jesus. Now, that is definitely penal. It is definitely substitutionary, but that is not over against the idea of God winning the victory over evil. People have played those off against each
Christus
other.
Victor.
Christus Victor versus substitution. That's a false antithesis, as I explain in the other book. But likewise, it isn't substitution or representation. Substitution works through representation because Jesus represents, Israel represents the world, so he can validly and appropriately take upon himself the evil, the suffering, etc., so that God condemns sin in the... Now, of course, it was the same event. It doesn't mean that the cross was not a brutal, horrible, violent, ugly, incredibly painful experience. But what was going on was not the theology of God hating the world so that he killed his own son, but God hating sin so that he defeated it in the person of his son. And that only works if you understand Paul's entire train of thought. And sadly, ever since the Middle Ages, much Western Christianity, Protestant as well as Catholic, simply hasn't got to the bottom of what Paul is saying, partly because they're bracketing out the Israel dimension. Back to that one again.
That raises another question I had for you, and you already answered a question that I wanted to ask you, which was, why is that significant that God condemned sin in Jesus rather than condemning Jesus? I found that to be a helpful point in your book. But you talk about exegesis. You say the aim of all exegesis ought to be to get to the point where we can say, stand here in the first century world of a well-taught Jewish thinker, look at things like this, and then you'll see that he has, in fact, that is Paul, said exactly what he meant. We don't have to help Paul to get it right. We have to allow him, you said, to go on teasing us until we all see his point, allowing the bits of the jigsaw to fall finally into place, which is more classic N.T. Wright. At Logos, we're constantly trying to put tools in people's hands, including the Paul for Everyone books and many other commentaries and dictionaries and lexicons, Bible study tools that help people perform accurate, careful exegesis. How does a person, a pastor, a Bible teacher, a Bible study leader, know whether he or she has let Paul do what you've described, or whether we are importing our contemporary categories into his sandals, which I know is a common concern of yours?
This is a hugely important point. And I don't want to make it sound too difficult, but it's interesting. When I was young, I used sometimes to visit elderly clergy. Some of my own elderly relatives were clergy, and they had friends, and I would get to meet them. And I remember noticing many times that elderly clergy would have on their shelves two books in particular. One was Alfred Edersheim's book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, and the other was Whiston's translation of Josephus. And as I got older, I realized these were the best tools available for pastors in the 19th century in the English-speaking world, so that they could at least try to get inside what was going on in the first century. I mean, if you just open the New Testament without any help at all, you meet the Pharisees and you meet the Sadducees, and you think, who are these guys? Are they just like our clergy, or are they different? Do we have any idea what they believe? And the answer is yes. Josephus tells us quite a lot about them, and Edersheim studied all that stuff, and he knew his rabbinic materials, etc. The great news is that over the last 100 years or more, we've learnt an enormous amount. And the pinpricks of those are things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it's not just that. There's been an enormous growth industry on the Jewish world, and multi-volume books about and what was going on in the first century and how Jewish people thought. And I was enormously fortunate because when I started my graduate work, some of that stuff was just coming out and new editions of the pseudepigrapha and goodness knows what. And I absolutely dived into it. And if you can see the wall behind me, two of those ranks of shelves are all on Second Temple Judaism, and there's more over there where you can't see as well. And that has been the world I've tried to live in. Now, the thing is that you don't have to have lots and lots of that for an awful lot of Paul to make sense. But every little advance that you make in terms of understanding first century Judaism gives you that little bit more insight, and you suddenly, oh, that's what that verse meant. One of my favorites is that line from when Jesus says, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? No. Well, what did you go out to see? And this isn't the coin in question. This is a Roman coin from the period. Actually, the denarius that
comes up so
not the
frequently
same
in the
one,
Gospels.
but from the issue that was shown to Jesus with the tribute money. But the archaeologists have found coins minted by Herod Antipas, which chose as Herod's symbol a Galilean reed, a reed shaking in the wind. As soon as you see that, that's what Jesus is talking about. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? Somebody like old waving reed up the road? Ah, no, you were looking for something different. And it becomes a bit clearer. Did you go out to see somebody wearing silks and satins? Well, you'd have to go to the royal palace to see that. So in other words, even a little bit, one coin will shed a flood of light. And so when you magnify that and understand how Jews of the time were telling the great story, how they were reading Deuteronomy, how they were reading Daniel 9, then all sorts of things come up. And then the aha moment comes when a text which was difficult and where the commentators had said, oh, well, what Paul really meant was such and such. In other words, poor old Paul, he didn't quite get it right. We will help this lame dog over the stile. The answer is no, he said exactly what he meant. And when you really get there, that aha is the sort of QED. This is really where he was. Of course, there's always more to Paul. I'm not saying I've solved all the problems in Paul, but I certainly feel I've got a lot further than we were doing 50 years ago when I started.
Appeal to ancient Near Eastern literature and Second Temple Jewish literature has both been helpful for me over time and raised a question for me that I want to ask you. Is there a ditch on the other side? Is it possible to treat, as one writer I read said, to treat the ancient Near Eastern literature, let's say, as perspicuous, clear in a way that the Bible isn't, and to let it overrule what Paul says or what Moses says in the Pentateuch?
Yeah, I mean, clarity is in the eye of the beholder. The old rule that you have to interpret the unclear text by the clear texts is an optical illusion, because things look clear. If you're a 16th century reformer looking for a particular doctrine of justification, you go to Romans, you go to Galatians, here it is, got it, now we interpret everything else in the light of that. But actually, they didn't get it because they were trying to answer the medieval questions with the biblical information, but the Bible wasn't addressing those medieval questions. So they were out of focus right from the beginning. And I've often said, you probably heard me say, we have to stop giving 19th century answers to 16th century questions and start giving 21st century answers to first century questions. And then we'll be getting somewhere. So it's in terms of the other literature of the time, other Jewish literature, but also Greco-Roman literature, and then later on Syriac literature, and though I can't read it, ancient Egyptian literature, etc. As a historian, I want the whole lot. I haven't got space in my head or in my study for everything that there might be, but I was a classicist originally, and so much about the Greek and the Roman world makes sense. And of course there are unclear passages in it. Scholars in those worlds have as much trouble as we biblical scholars do. But you can see how they think. You can see how the battles between the Epicureans and the Stoics were playing out, and so on. And then we put Paul in that world, and it makes sense. He's squaring off against this group here or against that group there. So it's not either or. It's not that they are all clear and then the Bible is unclear. It's that as a historian, we're trying to understand what these texts were meant to be about. And then part of that is, where are they disagreeing with their contemporaries? I mean, one of my favorite passages in the New Testament is Acts 17, where Paul is arguing with the Athenian philosophers in a court setting. I mean, he's on trial, but he's knocking spots off the Stoics and the Epicureans and the academics while he's doing it.
Our Logos users are smart folks, and one of our power users had a question for you. Romans 8:24 says, "In hope we were saved." What does Paul think the Romans were saved from? What were they saved to? And how were they saved? That was a power user question sent in.
The context of that passage is, of course, where creation as a whole is groaning in travail. It looks as though the world is in, as we would say, meltdown. There are wars and rumors of wars, there are earthquakes, there are famines, there are whatever. How can we survive? And of course, many ancient pagans didn't really have very much hope at all. In fact, if you look up hope in a classical dictionary, there probably won't be an entry, except for that odd thing about Pandora's box, that hope is the last thing left, which is a way of saying when all else is gone, you can always dream, kind of thing. But if you look up hope in a Jewish dictionary, there'll probably be quite a significant bit of material on there. So what Paul is saying is actually, it's about God the Creator, that this world is made by a good Creator whose good purposes are going to be fulfilled. And so then he's just said, creation itself will be set free from its slavery to decay, to obtain the freedom that comes when God's children are glorified. And then the resurrection of God's people, as in Romans 8, 10 and 11, that is the hope that we have, but it's not resurrection into a body with nowhere to live. It's resurrection to be the royal priesthood for the new creation. Back in Romans 5:17, he talks about those who receive the gift of righteousness will reign in life. Just like in Revelation 5, those who are redeemed by the Lamb are not redeemed by his blood so that they can go up to a place called heaven and hang around listening to people playing harps. They're rescued in order to be the royal priesthood, in order to rule God's new creation with wisdom and justice and mercy and beauty. So we are saved from the collapse of the whole cosmos for God's new creation. And that passage, by the way, is the heart of, as I argue in the book, the heart of Paul's picture of vocation, because the central section of Romans 8, verses 12 to 30, is not about salvation. That's the outer framework. The central section is about vocation. Who are we called to be in the present time? And we are called to be people who, out of gratitude for being saved in that hope, now take up our responsibility as prayerful people, as lamenting people, at the heart of God's still wounded and bruised and battered world.
Speaking of hearts, we've been discussing the book Into the Heart of Romans by Dr. N.T. Wright. Dr. Wright, I have one more very important question for you. Are you the theologian we have to thank for bringing the phrase "not least" into theological discourse, or do we look for another?
That's a great question. I have no idea. I don't know when and why I first started saying "not least," but it's curious that you've picked that up, and it may be. I'm told that there are artificial intelligence chatbots now which have downloaded chunks of my books, and if you ask them to write an article in the style of N.T. Wright, it'll probably have "not least" in every other paragraph.
It would probably be the title. Yeah.
It might be. That's really worrying. So it's one of those glitches. I said to a friend who was talking with me yesterday that it was only when she had, several years ago now, pointed out to me a theme in my regular preaching that I realized that I've been preaching about it such a lot. I just hadn't realized it. She said, "You seem to be banging on about this quite a lot recently." Oh, yeah, maybe I have. So thank you for that.
It's not a criticism.
I'll probably never say it again now, out of embarrassment.
No. You must not cease. It's endearing. It helps me know immediately who I'm reading. You are one of those writers. I can pick up an article or a chapter, let's just imagine somewhere on the internet, and I didn't actually pay attention to who wrote it. This does happen sometimes. You see a headline, and within a paragraph, I know that it's you. N.T. Wright's book, Into the Heart of Romans, put out by Zondervan Academic, available in Logos and wherever such books are sold. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright, for joining us to discuss Into the Heart of Romans.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good talking to you.
Likewise, thank you for joining us here at Logos Live. Join us again next time for an interesting discussion with writers in the field of biblical studies.